All right, everyone, we're about to get started with our panel, Alabama versus the Great Reset. My name is Will Blakely. I'm a reporter with 1819 News. So I guess to cut right to the chase, I mean, the panel today is about the Great Reset. And so the Great Reset is a term used by the World Economic Forum and other global policymakers. But as Alan said earlier, some do dismiss it as just a conspiracy theory. And so could y'all explain to us what you believe the Great Reset agenda is and whether or not it is a real threat to Alabama today?
The Great Reset is a globalist plan engineered by NGOs, in particular the World Economic Forum, in conjunction with the UN. They signed a contract in 2019 to accelerate the attainment of the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So the Great Reset could be understood as a public-private partnership arrangement to accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030. And what are those? Those are a bunch of, it's written in nothing but doublespeak and, propaganda. But it's really about mitigating so-called climate change, supposedly eradicating poverty in the world, which really just means government transfers of wealth from the developed world to the developing world to keep them from developing. It is, there's all these other goals like gender equality. Gender equality really has to do with making sure women only work in the professional lives and do not have children. Sustainability, one of the things about sustainability, this buzzword that they use, there is a population control agenda involved with sustainability. It is not strictly about keeping the environment sustainable. They believe that there's too much consumption in the developed world, and we need to keep these people from reproducing and eating meat and guzzling gas. So there's a real strict thing there. What it means to Alabama is, we'll let others talk about that, but it'll affect everybody. So one way to understand the Great Reset is it is the opposite of decentralization. So whereas we want decentralization, get the federal government off our backs, get to the local level as much as possible, they want to agglomerate the state into a central world global state. And so it is the exact opposite impetus that drives people like us, liberty-minded people.
So I'm Brian Dawson. I'm the CEO of 1819 News. If you've ever been in a room, and especially on a panel where you think everyone in the room is smarter than you, I've reached that point in my life right this moment. I'm not a think tank guy, so they brought this redneck up here to balance things out a little bit. So I think the conspiracy theorist aspect is the thing, and it's starting to lose its appeal, like calling someone racist or xenophobic or homophobic. That used to be quite the punch to someone, but now they've thrown it around so much that it's basically gone, and I think that's happening with conspiracy theorists. One of the few positives that came out of COVID was that it used to be about 6 months for a conspiracy theory to come true. Now we're at about 90 days-ish. So I think that's interesting, but I think to me, the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset, all of these things, it springs from Karl Marx and the Long March to the Institutions and the ultimate fulfillment of what I believe. I'm a Christian, and I believe Karl Marx was demon-possessed, and he wrote his manifesto and died and went to a funeral, and there was like 3 people there. No one even knew who he was. And those writings were picked up by Lenin and Stalin and pushed into Bolshevik Revolution, which is anti-West, anti-everything that Christendom or the West is about. And so I think this is the fulfillment of it. They hate everything we stand for, and this is what they're trying. I think it's peak Long March Through the Institutions. I think how it's going to affect Alabama. So, man, I don't want to give a whole political history of Alabama. That would take forever. The short version is business runs the state here. And I'm not talking about mom and pop business. I'm talking Alabama Power, Regions, Blue Cross, Blue Shield. Those people, that's who runs this state, okay? And what's interesting is that's always been a very Republican thing. Big business, Republican, okay. Well, now the head of the Business Council of Alabama, which is our state chamber of commerce, is a lady named Helena Duncan, and she's essentially a Marxist, right? And so what you're starting to see is Alabama Power and these other big corporations that have always ran this state are bowing the knee to ESG. They're bowing the knee to all of these socialist policies and everything else, and that's going to take big business left, and it will be interesting to see whether that's going to take the people of Alabama with it, and I don't think it will. The problem that we've always had in our state is that we have the most conservative people in the world, in the United States, that live right here in Alabama, but we don't have legislation and government that reflects it, right? And so that's a big goal of 1819 News, is to be able to inform the people of Alabama about what's going on so that they can get involved in government and get a legislation and governor and things that actually reflect them. So, but I think that's where it's going to affect Alabama the most, is going to be these big, we call them the big mules. The big mules are buying into ESG, and that's who runs our politics and runs our state. And all the guys that run around every 4 years to get elected talking about how much they love Jesus, guns, and free markets, well, the people that are paying, putting money in their campaigns are going to be pushing them to move left with ESG and everything else. So there's going to be a fight, and I think Alabama's ready for a fight. So there you go.
I've got a mic, is it on? Yep. Well, ESG is going to affect, of course, Alabama and every state. There's a reason why the Who Cares Wins conference with the United Nations, again, government of Switzerland et al., targeted financial institutions and capital markets as the place to start, because that's where all capital flows are. You look at the industries that make money with money, and you realize that if we can control all capital flow, then we can control everything beneath that framework. So that's why people like executives at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, et cetera, big accounting firms, big investment firms, were all invited to Who Cares Wins, and that's why they are invited to the World Economic Forum as well. Alabama has made some efforts to push back, nothing like DeSantis in Florida or Texas and West Virginia are doing a lot to push back, but we did sign on to an anti-ESG alliance. 18 states signed on to that. Our Attorney General Steve Marshall has joined a lawsuit against the Department of Labor, which was considering, it instituted a rule to allow for ESG 401k investments. But will ESG affect Alabama? Of course, it affects everybody, and everybody that has investments. I mean, I think the best thing we can do is, raise the alarm bells, ring the alarm bells, because if ESG-weighted portfolios continue to underperform on the market, I think money still talks. I think when people start seeing that they're not getting returns on investment because their mutual fund manager or BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, their asset manager, if they have money with those entities, or if it's the state pensioners who are having their state pension funds invested in ESG-weighted portfolios that are not doing as well as other portfolios, then you're going to see some outcry. But people have to pay attention and have to watch the performance of those things, because the only way ESG works is if you get full systematic buy-in. Because investment is traditionally predicated on this notion of diversification, right? You want your funds spread out across as many different industries as possible, as many different fields as possible, to mitigate risk, right? If one field starts doing badly, then another one's going to prop you up and all that. Well, ESG, by definition, it already narrows the range of possible fields in which you can invest. It's got to be in only these particular industries and these particular companies. And that is the opposite of diversification. And you'll hear people talk about, the ESG proponents talk about risk management as if the risk is going to be climate change, but it's long-term risk. They always emphasize that it's long-term risk. Well, that means that after 2 years, after 3 years, after 4 years, when these climate catastrophes haven't happened, they can just keep saying, well, it's long term. It just hasn't happened yet. The risk is long term. And also they warned against regulatory risk while paying all these lobbyists to champion these regulations. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're like, oh, you're going to get all these regulations. For example, the SEC rule that I talked about earlier, you're going to get all these regulations and they're going to be a risk to you as an investor long term. Well, then they're actually paying lobbyists to try to get these regulations passed. So it's very deceptive, and of course it affects Alabama, it affects every state, and it affects every human being that banks.
Yeah, and so you listen to a lot of what's said from the World Economic Forum and what comes out of ESG, and a word that I think most of us would use to describe a lot of these things is woke. Now, of course, recently a slew of left-wing pundits have accused people on the right of not being able to define the word woke. I don't think they have read any of Michael's books. So, Michael, if you could define the word woke for us and just explain what it has to do with the Great Reset and maybe how it's found its way into Alabama.
Oh, I'm sure it's found its way into Alabama. I'm sure everybody could attest to that. Well, this word woke has a fairly long history. Of course, it was first a past tense verb, right? It means having woken up or having awakened. But it started to be used as an adjective in the 1970s by the African American community, and it just meant like aware of what's happening. And then it transmuted into conscious of racial injustice. And then it was taken up and finally got its way into being effectively associated with social justice, and it became a kind of equivalent of social justice. And so it's supposed to be redressing all of these inequities between various peoples, various constituencies, and it's supposedly to benefit these beleaguered groups. But really what it is, and its function with reference to the Great Reset is this. It is about guilt-tripping the population into believing that everything they have is a function of their privilege, which therefore should be revoked so that they will not have any rights or property. And so it makes them feel fine with this idea that it's supposed to make you feel that you should accept these reduced expectations that come with the Great Reset, this reduced consumption, this reduced mobility, economic and physical mobility. Basically, the function of wokeness is to make it's to attack the majority and their way of life. And they use guilt, and they figure everything in terms of privilege, which can be revoked. Rights and privileges are different. Rights supposedly inhere in the individual, but privileges are something that are extended to you. And likewise, if we take them away, then you haven't really lost anything you deserved. And that's really the function of wokeness.
So if you go read any company's ESG report, when they put it out, one thing that you'll quickly notice is under S, you see a lot of references to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. And so, Alan, since you're the higher ed guy, could you explain exactly what DEI is and whether or not it purports to do what its objectives are?
Oh, I'd be thrilled to do that. Well, nominally, the D stands for diversity, but it actually means uniformity of thought, so it's the opposite. The E nominally means equity, but it's all about treating people unequally based upon immutable characteristics such as their race. For example, if you are white, then you are treated with discrimination. You are alleged to have privilege that you must basically leave at the door, and it means all sorts of affirmative action type programs. You get different forms of like training in the workplace that teaches you that if you are born one way with a skin color one way, that you are responsible for a whole range of injustices and past historical discrimination that happened long before you were born, and that therefore your role is to let other people have positions and power regardless of their merit, whether they've earned it, whether they have the requisite wherewithal, skills, talent, or knowledge. They are entitled to that position, and this is a form of quote-unquote equity, which is all about equal outcomes rather than pure equality. And then inclusion is all about exclusion. In fact, inclusion means you have to believe what we believe to be part of this belongingness. If you do not believe what we believe, then you are automatically excluded. So it means exactly the exact opposite. Each term sounds good in theory, but in practice and in the way it's done is very dangerous and in fact leads to all kinds of systemic problems that become instituted in law. Again, I like to use the phrase encoding elite preferences. When the elites encode their preferences in law, administrative agencies, universities, bureaucracies, so that they're so much more difficult to dislodge. Once they're embedded, it's hard to get them out. So when you talk about, systemic racism or something like that, you've got systemic anti-racism, which is, systemic measures that are put into law, institutions, administrative agencies with the express purpose of discriminating against people based on actually their skin color. The thing that we used to decry, people, the whole Martin Luther King line about, judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, that's long gone for the left now. They want to judge you based upon the color of your skin, regardless of regardless of what you think. You're automatically disqualified from having a legitimate opinion if you look a certain way.
Having been canceled by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion group at NYU. By the way, the Mises Institute mistakenly put New York University on my name tag. That's why I will not wear it. I was one of the first professorial victims of the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, which I like to say, rather than DEI, I call it DIE, die. They canceled me they said, the content and structure of my thoughts. So this was a wrong-think conviction in an Orwellian courtroom in which I had no witnesses and wasn't able to testify for myself. So yeah, this is what DIE comes down to. It's an execution squad. The conformity, I think I was the first to coin this. It's the conformity, inequity, and exclusion group, is what I call that group that came after me. Anyway.
So this is a question for all of y'all. Alabama is a Republican supermajority. We're a conservative state. But how equipped are we to, resist the Great Reset, and what exactly can we do on a state level?
I think the Republican supermajority thing, and it was really interesting. I just read an article the other day, I think it was by the Daily Wire. It actually says the thicker your Republican majority is, the more moderate your legislature is, which is really weird. And I'd never seen that on a broad scale. I thought maybe it was just something that Alabama suffered from. But in particularly, how are we going to push back against the Great Reset? I think information, knowledge, and resistance from the people is what it boils down to. Let's use COVID as the example. So here we are, Kay Ivey came out during all those things as state after state was shutting down, blue state after blue state, and she literally came out and said, "We're not California, we're not gonna lock down." And 3 days later, she locked us down and gave us a, what do they call that, where you can't go out after 7, a curfew. And The thought that we had a curfew in Alabama is just mind-boggling. But what do you do with the curfew? Don't go out after 7. Well, I'll see you guys after 7. We'll go somewhere and meet, right? And so that is, I think, what it boils down to me, because as long as Alabama is dependent on federal funds and federal funds flowing to the state, for our economic well-being, we're never going to be able to be who we actually are. And so the hope would be to elect people who begin to wean us off of federal dollars. So a political solution would be looking for candidates that can actually win, who are running on getting off the federal teat, right? And so I think that's a big piece of it. But to me, I think just the ability for people to resist. And so Alabama was the least vaccinated state, okay? You should give yourselves a round of applause for that. Every media outlet in the country, in the nation, mainstream media, was slandering and pounding the state of Alabama for our vaccine hesitancy, right? This disease we have called vaccine hesitancy. And so we were being berated, insulted, called no good, dirty rednecks, and all this other stuff, and we just stood. Even Donald Trump came here and told us to get vaccinated, and we booed him, right? And so the reason I love Alabama is the people, and we have what it takes to resist. Put your mask on, no. Get vaccinated, not gonna do it. Your kid has to wear a mask in school, no he doesn't, right? That's really it, like, no, just say no. And I think that's where it begins with us, but as a political standpoint, it's that dependence upon federal dollars flowing to the state, and it's gonna be hard to break.
Yeah, I will say there's a resistance movement that wasn't there before. I mean, you've got an underdog media outlet in 1819 News, which is not docile, submissive, or complicit in all these things, and doing great work. You've got actually Matt Clark, who's sitting right here, is an attorney who founded the Alabama Center for Law and Liberty. There was no litigation mechanism for challenging a lot of sort of statist and unconstitutional practices and conditions, and ACLL is now one of them. Matt recently filed an open records request with the RSA, asking basically specifically whether the state was using BlackRock, but needs to do more. I think we need a lot more of that. We need to look at all the asset management firms. We need to look at what proxy advisory services we're employing in the state. I actually, I mentioned earlier that by speaking out and launching an anti-woke business program, I just happened to get in touch with people all over the country who were surprised that such a thing could actually happen on a university campus. And there's one guy that communicates with me quite regularly, and he's in Pennsylvania. And I think he just sits and watches YouTube videos all day. And he sent me a video last week that has the CEO of ISS. First of all, the recording, this YouTube video had 26 views. And in the video, the CEO of ISS is telling his interlocutor that, oh yes, we are doing investment stuff that actually will hurt state pensioners, it will underperform, but in the long run, it's sort of necessary to get ESG. And I'm like, this is it. This is like a smoking gun for a lawsuit. 26 views. So, I think there are opportunities to litigate some of these things, and we need to start doing that.
Yeah, I'm not going to preempt my own talk, but I have a 9-point plan for stopping the Great Reset.